Washington Journal continues.
A discussion on debt and the federal budget with two guests joining us this morning. Ben Ritz with the Progressive Policy Institute. He's their director of the Center for Funding America's Future. Also joined by Romina Baccia of the Cato Institute. She is their budget and entitlement policy director. To both of you, thanks for being on the program.
Good morning, Pedro.
Thanks for having us.
When it comes to matters of budget, one of the things that we've all been talking about all morning in the last couple of weeks is the idea of keeping the government funded via short-term CRs, another one possibly taking place as early as today. Let's start there. What do you think about that as a strategy in light of a long-term strategy to fund budget and a long-term strategy for budget on the federal government?
I mean, short-term continuing resolutions are not ideal because you can't set new policies, so you get stuck with the policies of the past. However, I think the political reality is that the divisions between the House and the Senate are just too big, which is why we're seeing these stopgap funding bills. The question is, what is at the end of the road here? Because in most cases, we've seen Congress pass an omnibus bill just before Christmas, and at least agencies had about 9 months to figure out what new program spending looked like. Now we're talking about a continuing resolution that goes into February, so there isn't much time left for agencies to really implement any new policy changes that Congress will want to pass by then. So at this point, it's, I think, a sign of the dysfunction that we're witnessing more broadly in this Congress dealing with fiscal issues, the debt being, of course, the major one here, and the appropriation cycle is just a signal of that dysfunction where members of Congress rally around to demonstrate what their policy interests are and using appropriations as a way to gain leverage because there's few other mechanisms for them to do so.
And Mr. Riss, one of the reasons that it seems to be getting Democratic support, at least for the short-term CRs, is no policy changes being introduced in this document. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the right move. I think that one of the challenges that former Speaker McCarthy had was trying to load these bills up with partisan poison pills to rally his own caucus. And I think that the fact that Johnson is leading, at least at this point, with a bill that doesn't have any of those riders and that doesn't do egregious deep spending cuts, I think makes it a much more serious offer than what we've seen in the past.
If this is a short term right now, what's the guarantee that another short term process happens early next year? Should this bill pass and should those deadlines come?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, ultimately what we need to see is Republicans be willing to stick to the deal they made back during the debt limit deal. In May, there was an agreement by President Biden, the leadership of all four parties in Congress. A majority of all the conferences in Congress agreed on spending levels for next year. And part of the reason we're in this mess is because under McCarthy, they were not able, there was a push by the far right to cut spending deeply below those agreed upon levels. So I think in order to not be jumping from short-term solution to short-term solution and to finally do full year appropriations, there needs to be a recognition by House Republicans specifically that they need to stick to the deal they cut with everybody else.
And Ms. Baccia, the House Republicans, one of the things they're touting is like we're actually passing appropriations bills now and doing that process. We haven't seen that before, but go ahead.
Well, I actually think that this goes both sides because Senate Democrats have also not been sticking to the Fiscal Responsibility Act from May. They have been loading up their appropriations bills with additional emergency spending for things that don't really qualify as an emergency, but are just regular operations, including salaries for the FBI, for example. And so it's abusing the emergency spending category to increase spending above those levels that is also contributing to the dysfunction here. So I think both sides here need to grab themselves by the nose and say, we made a deal, neither one of us is sticking to it, so that's where we are.
Our guest's with us until 9 o'clock, and if you want to ask him questions about matters of debt in the federal budget, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, and 202-748-8002 for independents. If you want to text us your questions or comments, it's 202-748-8003. To that end, do you think that the Senate and the House ultimately, should these appropriations bills pass on both sides, the figures included will be different? How do they resolve that, and can they resolve that, do you think?
They'll have to eventually resolve it. Otherwise, we will not have full year appropriations bills. Although at this point, we're talking about maybe 6 to 8 months, with this current continuing resolution going into February. But I would say that another poison pill that Ben didn't mention is that in all of the cases we saw the Biden administration try to tack on additional supplemental spending. We tallied it up now at over $160 billion, and that on top of a $2 trillion deficit, which we're suffering under right now, just seems very fiscally irresponsible. So I think the whole process just shows that Congress is fighting over a shrinking portion of the budget, discretionary spending, as spending on health care, Social Security, and other mandatory programs continues to grow. And that's where we need the focus to shift, because the pie of discretionary spending is going to continue to shrink. We're going to continue to see dysfunction in that portion of the budget and wrangling for limited resources if we don't address the bigger drivers of spending and debt.
And I do want to address those bigger drivers, but to the idea of the president's supplemental requests, particularly Israel and Ukraine being part of that, how should that be handled at this stage, or should it be handled at this stage?
I think it's important that we fund these priorities. I mean, these are important national security challenges, and especially with regard to Ukraine, if we don't deal with the problem now with Russian aggression in Europe, I think there is the potential for that to become a much greater cost in the long term. Right now, we have Ukraine really fighting for itself. We don't have to put U.S. troops there. We're basically just keeping them armed, and they're willing to do the fight for their independence and to hold the line for democracy in Europe. And I think that is an important investment that we're able to protect and fully fund. And I wouldn't nickel and dime. When we're talking about a $2 trillion deficit, $160 billion for a 1 or 2 year emergency, I think is perfectly reasonable. But to Ramina's point, which I agree with, as we continue to not address the problems of our debt and deficit and the true drivers of them, these sort of challenges will become more difficult to address in the future.
And then, because both of you brought it up, true drivers, it seems like everybody has an idea of exactly what those drivers are. How do you define that, Mr. Ritz?
I would define it as the cost of our retirement and health care programs growing faster than the revenues we need to support them as a result of our aging population.
Ms. Bacha?
One way I look at this is the unfunded obligations that the federal government carries on the books, and the Treasury shows that 95% of the federal government's long-term unfunded obligations, that's that gap that Ben mentioned between what the government plans on spending and what we are projected to collect in tax revenues. 95% of that unfunded obligation is driven by two programs, and that is Medicare and Social Security.
And so we'll have probably discussions during, and I'm sure we'll get questions on it as well, though. But as far as a resolve, Congress has talked about these issues for months, probably years, decades or so. Why, up until this point, no real resolve to correct those problems?
We fundamentally face a political problem when it comes to these old age benefit programs. And we're seeing this in this election cycle. President Biden, during his State of the Union, made it very toxic to even discuss the need for reform of Medicare and Social Security. And so we have seen even Republicans that have been fiscally conservative on these issues retreating as they're being attacked in campaign videos. That is not conducive to finding a bipartisan agreement to tackle what are fundamental structural challenges that our nation faces as the U.S. population is aging, fertility has declined. These programs have not been structured in a way that they are affordable for generations to come. And both programs, Medicare and Social Security, are actually projected to run out of borrowing authority before 2033. So we're looking at less than 10 years down the road where Congress will have to make a decision what to do, or beneficiaries would face automatic benefit cuts to the tune of 23%, and those would hit indiscriminately, and I don't think anybody wants that to happen.
Mr. Ritz, same question.
Yeah, so I would just make 2 points. The first is, I think, with respect to President Biden's State of the Union call, I think that has made things more difficult, and we have seen a chronic unwillingness to tackle entitlement spending. But what I would say is, number one, that's a bipartisan problem. Donald Trump, when he ran for president, also ran on a similar pledge. And also, unlike President Biden, he has stuck to the Republican pledge of no new taxes. And so the combination of Republican tax cuts and bipartisan unwillingness to talk about entitlement spending, I think, is why we've had the problem. The other point I want to raise is that for the last decade, we had warnings of a fiscal crisis coming, but there wasn't really any pressure to deal with it. Interest costs were low as we were coming out of the financial crisis, and that didn't really put any pressure. As we're now seeing interest rates and inflation really skyrocketing, we're going to see not trillion-dollar deficits, trillion-dollar interest payments within the next couple of years. And so I think that should hopefully light a fire under lawmakers to address this in a way that they haven't been willing to for some time.
We have calls lined up for both of you, so let's take some. Let's start with Howard in Indiana. Democrats line, you're on with our guests. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. I hear these discussions relative to debt and budget, federal budget, that is, and I'm frustrated every time these discussions take place because they're not rational. The federal government is funded by, first, a congressional appropriations, and then the issuance of a sovereign fiat currency. It's not based on revenue generation. It's not based on loans that we have to issue when we issue currency. We can issue currency free of taxes, free of loans or debt. We need to have a rational discussion where we establish our federal budget based on our productive national capacity. I think things like Medicare for all should be funded. A single-payer health care, that is, should be funded because just this morning, for example, I read a report out of JAMA. That's I'm not sure what that stands for, but I think it's a well-respected medical journal that says the life expectancy of Americans have fallen generally, and for men, they've fallen 6 years below women, primarily citing preventative care as one of the major drivers. A single health care system would enable that. When we fully budget to our productive capacity, we enable the individual to be effective active in the economy. That grows.
Gotcha, caller. Thank you very much. Mr. Ritz.
Yeah, so what I would say, I think it's absolutely important that we, and I just want to thank you, Howard, for your call. I think it's absolutely important that we look at our real productive capacity, but what I would say is that right now we're at it. We're running $2 trillion deficits. We've had the highest inflation, I think, in my lifetime. And that is something that economists across the spectrum agree is a sign that it's now a time to look at getting our fiscal house in order. I think that these debates over, is the deficit representative of productive capacity, I think the time for those has passed, and now it's clear, no matter what economic theory you subscribe to, we are now spending above that capacity, and we have to look at reining it in.
Ms. Baccia.
The position that I just heard from the caller is referred to as modern monetary theory, and we saw this on display recently at a House Budget Committee hearing about whether there's a need for a fiscal commission. Representative Yarmouth put forth this theory as well, and it goes something like this: the government shouldn't worry about interest payments or borrowing because we can just print all the money that we need or want for whatever we think is important for the government to do. And that is a recipe for massive inflation, and we saw some of this during the pandemic, as the Fed was buying a lot of treasury bonds in order to support the emergency spending happening. And there's a real risk that if Washington does not come to agreement for how to address the unsustainable growth in healthcare and retirement programs, that there will be more pressure on the Federal Reserve to issue more currency in order to support Treasury borrowing at a time when the markets seem to be retreating and less interested in especially buying long-term government bonds, as investors expect higher inflation for longer given our massive deficits. And so this is a very dangerous and I think misleading theory to base public policy decisions on, because there are several countries that have played this out, printed money and spent it without limits, and they're called Venezuela and Zimbabwe, and things have not been pretty there.
This is from our Republican line in Ohio. Brian, hello.
Hello, good to have you. Thank you for taking my call. I'm going back to what she said about the omnibus bill and about our continuing resolution. I think the continuing resolution needs to make sure that we have something addressing our border at the north and our border at the south. I know that the 117th Congress when they was in, they did the omnibus bill, which far exceeded their term, which is basically called legislative entrenchment. So that kept our hands tied until September, which, I think that continuing resolution is not good unless we got something done with our homeland first.
So to that end, Ms. Bacha, is the best continuing resolution a clean resolution without any attachments like the caller brought up?
Well, arguably, when Congress debates spending levels, they should be debating policy priorities as well. But because there are disagreements about things such as additional border funding, the question is, are you willing to use those disagreements and risk a government shutdown? And both parties seem to not be interested in having one, especially with Thanksgiving around the corner. And so it's very unlikely that provisions like this, which are considered politically contentious, will be attached.
Mr. Ritz, is it sometimes that works, though, attaching these things in order to get something done?
I think attaching things to get something done generally makes sense in the context of broader long-term spending bills. I think, when you have a continuing resolution and you have a shutdown threat imminent in the next couple days and you're nowhere near a compromise, I think that's not the time to attach things that could lead to a government shutdown.
Robert is in Texas. Independent line. Hi, you're on.
Good morning, Pedro, and to the guests, good morning as well. What are your thoughts concerning universal basic income? What are your thoughts when people mention that as part of a policy, as part of a appropriations package, as a right of entitlement? And hear me out, because there have been a number of people, both currently and historically, that have advocated for it. Milton Friedman, and Richard Nixon tried to pass it through Congress in 1969 as part of his family assistance plan. And Thomas Paine, in his pamphlet Agrarian Justice, advocated for it as well. To Pedro, when will you have Scott Sansons on the show? Because he is a very strong advocate for universal basic income, and with the amount of research that he and Andrew Yang have conducted on it, they could fill a book with it.
Okay. Thanks for the recommendation, but you may have to explain a little bit what it is. Mr. Ritz, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So universal basic income is this idea that the government will, whether it's through the tax code or through a check in the mail, will send everybody a basic monthly subsistence allowance, a check basically. And it's sort of like Social Security for everyone. To the question, I think there's two questions there. The first is, does it make sense to do in the aggregate, and the second is, does it make sense to do, as the caller suggested, on an appropriations bill? On an appropriations bill, I would say the answer is pretty much no. Appropriations bills are for discretionary spending, and that is the part of the budget that is appropriated each year. This being a new entitlement program, we would want to consider that in more of a broader context, since it's a long-term program. As far as whether it makes sense, I think there are arguments for it and against it. I am personally not a fan, but I think the biggest challenge is that if we were to decide to do it, people would have to be willing to pay for it. Andrew Yang, when he proposed a universal basic income, he proposed to fund it with an across-the-board value-added tax, like a national sales tax. I think such a tax has merit for discussion, but we have to realize that is going to be a tax that is in excess of President Biden's $400,000 pledge. Everyone's going to have to pay it. And the amount Yang proposed was not nearly enough to cover the cost of the UBI he wanted to do.
Ms. Bacha.
I would only add that we have to think about what are we trying to accomplish with this UBI, and to the degree that fiscal conservatives and libertarians like Milton Friedman were in favor of it, it was always in the context of eliminating the welfare state, making welfare provision more efficient by just giving people direct cash instead of the litany of government agencies that administer a variety of programs, and also in the context of government programs that target benefits towards those in need tend to also have unintended side effects, discouraging work, for example. But without replacing the welfare state and just adding it on top, I think it would actually discourage work, and there's a question as to what is the purpose of this additional payment.
$33 trillion is the current U.S. debt, if I recall, or if that's what they tell me. The Treasury Department tells us that our national deficit is $66 trillion. Or maybe I'm reading that wrong, but how do we get here as far as in the short term? Ms. Bacha?
It's been a combination of policies, but in the big picture is that the government has spent more than it's raised in revenue in almost every year, except for some short periods of surpluses, most recently in the 2000s. And so that gap contributes to this growing national debt. But in terms of the biggest drivers, Medicare and overall healthcare spending has been one of the largest drivers. And I would also say that we should not discount emergency spending, these repeated bouts of additional spending increases, like the Biden administration is now calling for an additional $160 billion. They do add up. And if we look at emergency spending over the past 30 years, roughly $1 out of every $10 that the federal government has spent has been labeled as emergency spending, whether that was following 9/11 or stimulus spending during the Great Recession, or the massive emergency spending increase we saw during the COVID pandemic. There's also a trend where government abuses emergency spending as a label in order to get around spending caps, which are a result of Congress focusing on the wrong thing, trying to tighten discretionary spending, the 1/3 of the budget that is shrinking, while allowing mandatory spending, which governs health care and Social Security and other welfare programs, is allowed to continue growing unabated on autopilot based on laws that Congress adopted, in many cases, decades ago. And that's where we need to grab the reins and make reforms.
And I want to ask you also, where do you think tax revenue comes in on that as well?
Yes, so tax revenue actually is fairly high at the moment. It's been retreating over the past year. But if you look at the increase in spending since 2019, it was about 46%, while tax revenues grew 28%. So what we're seeing is rising tax revenues chasing ever higher spending. And there is a limit to how much the government can tax, because that is a reflection of our economy's productive capacity and the willingness of Americans to pay those taxes. Especially wealthier income earners tend to have more options to move their income abroad or move themselves and their families abroad, and so there's only so much you can tax without imposing higher taxes on all Americans. And so to pay for the welfare state that Democrats envision, I don't think they'll be able to hold to, well, I know they won't be able to hold to the $400,000 tax pledge. Everyone is going to have to pay higher taxes, whether that's higher income taxes or potentially a new tax such as a value-added tax.
Mr. Ritz, same questions to you.
Yeah, so I agree with some of what Romina said. I think that one important piece of context on tax revenues is that even though taxes are going up, part of that, from a nominal dollars perspective, part of that is a combination of inflation, population growth, our economy is growing, and so the right way to look at it, I think, is as a percent of economic output. And on that level, taxes are not the highest they've been for all time. It's I think, a more reasonable level. But I do also think that as our society is aging, the reality is we're going to need some mix of modernizing those programs, but also there's going to have to be more revenue to support them, because in the past our society had more workers paying the benefits of each retiree than we're going to have moving forward, and that's just going to require some higher tax revenue.
Two guests joining us for this discussion. You just heard from Ben Ritz with the Progressive Policy Institute, a little bit about the Institute, what it does, and what you focus on.
Yeah, sure. So I'm the director of PPI's Center for Funding America's Future, and basically we are a center-left think tank. We're focused on fiscal policy, and we're focused on trying to strengthen public investments in a fiscally responsible way. So I like to think of us as sort of the voice on this for a fiscally responsible center left.
And Romina Bacha of the Cato Institute, a little bit about your organization.
Yeah, the Cato Institute is a nonpartisan libertarian think tank based here in Washington, D.C., and we advise Congress as well as educate the public on the classical liberal tradition, economic freedom, and the benefits of peace and individual liberty for everyone in society.
Let's hear from Linda. She's in Connecticut. Democrats line, you're on with our guest. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. First of all, in a discussion like this, I think that we should call things what they actually are. Social Security and Medicare are insurance programs. I don't know about you, but I've been paying insurance for a long time, and I've never had an insurance policy who didn't adjust their premiums when to accordingly pay what it owes to its policyholders. Social Security and Medicare haven't had a premium increase since Reagan was president. Now, this is math. This isn't policy. This is math. We have to raise the premiums on our insurance policies. They're not entitlements. Social Security has funded itself and will continue to do so until I believe it's 2030 maybe. But the whole discussion isn't honest because we don't call things what they are.
Okay, we'll leave it there, and we'll see if our guests agree with that perception. Mr. Ritz.
Sure. So thank you for the question. I think I absolutely do think that higher premiums, as the caller suggested, need to be part of the equation. I would say two things. Number one, there's been something of an automatic premium increase with the increase in the payroll tax cap that's been growing with wages over time. And the other thing I would say is that it's not just a question of revenue versus spending. I think there's also an intergenerational equity component to it. And, you know, if maybe it would have been the right move to just raise the premium 20, 30 years ago, but we've now had a situation where we've been underpaying into the program. We've got these deficits coming up for it. It's already spending more than it takes in and has been doing so for many years. And there's a question about whether these costs of these benefits for folks whose premiums didn't cover the cost of the program, should that be entirely borne by young Americans in the next generation, or should there be some balance between the two? And I'm more on the balance side.
Ms. Pacha.
I would agree with the balanced approach, but I think another thing to keep in mind here is that Social Security and Medicare benefits are getting more and more generous each and every year. If you look at the initial benefit formula that determines Social Security benefits, it is only loosely related to what people paid into the program. The initial benefit is actually indexed for wage growth in the economy, and that is one of the biggest drivers behind Social Security benefits getting more generous. We also should be looking at who needs those benefits. Are they getting adequate benefits? And then are there people that are getting benefits in excess of what's reasonable? For example, a dual earner, high earning couple can collect more than $9,000 a month from Social Security. I think that is excessive, and about 80% of Americans agree that we should look at reducing benefits for Social Security and Medicare for some of the wealthiest individuals. So rather than increasing people's taxes, which could reduce future investment and therefore reduce economic growth, if we cut back benefits for some wealthier retirees, we could save a lot of money that way in a less harmful way.
From Paul, Indianapolis, and Independent Line.
Good morning. I think that in terms of the question of how we got here, and over a long career in the Department of Defense, I saw the Carter administration, the Clinton administration, and the Obama administration cut back on the bones and muscle of the Defense Department, the maintenance and the training. And then when the next Republican administration gets in, the Democrats insist on increasing the spending on social programs exactly equal to the amount of money that's required to get the Department of Defense back to the point where it's useful. That's added a huge amount of money to the spending. We need to de-link those two and only spend on those things that the Constitution requires, and then we can add on to the extras.
Okay, well, let's leave it there. Ms. Pacha.
Mm-hmm. I agree with the caller. Thank you for that point. I think it doesn't make sense to tie defense and non-defense spending, and the Obama administration was particularly guilty of this and calling for parity, that every $1 increase in defense needed to be matched by a $1 increase on non-defense spending. And a lot of non-defense spending, I would argue, are for things that should be done at a state, local, or private level that the federal government doesn't need to be involved with to begin with. So there's no reason to link those two together other than for political leverage. And I think the caller is right on point there.
Mr. Ritz?
I unsurprisingly do not fully agree there. I think that a lot of these discretionary programs, domestic discretionary spending, that's the core of our public investment: scientific research, education, infrastructure, all of these things that we think of as basic public goods. That's in that tiny NDD part of the budget. And so I do think those are very important. But I also want to go to one thing the caller said, which is this idea of excessively deep defense cuts over time. I remember my first year at PPI, Congress appropriated for discretionary spending, that's defense and non-defense. They appropriated a non-defense level above what President Obama asked for in his final budget, and they appropriated above what Donald Trump asked for defense in his budget. And so I think the idea that the military is starving right now, and that we've cut it to the bone, I don't agree with that. And I think as we have these increasing national security needs like Israel and Ukraine, it's important that we don't underfund our defense capabilities, but I think we also need to be reasonable about what we actually do need to be spending money on there.
From Dennis, he's in Pennsylvania, Democrats line.
Hello, thanks for taking my call. Nancy Mace was on your program approximately 2 months ago, and she made the statement that there had to be spending cuts, and then she turns right around and says that there has to be tax cuts. She just equaled it out, did nothing to solve the debt problem. The Committee for a Responsible Budget says there has to be tax increases and spending cuts. And remember, it was Dick Cheney famously said that deficits don't matter. Thank you, and have a nice day.
Mr. Ritz.
Thank you. I completely agree with the caller. I don't know that I have. He said it perfectly. I think we do need taxes as part of the solution, and when we have Republicans doing the Trump tax cuts, doing the Bush tax cuts, trillions and trillions of dollars in lost revenue, and then calling for saying we can't afford spending programs, I think that's hypocritical. It means that Republicans are not actually addressing the problem, and both sides really need to be putting forward serious savings as opposed to just using taxes to pay for new spending or using spending cuts to pay for new tax cuts, because otherwise we're not going to get the problem under control.
I think that Americans have long been suffering from what Jim Buchanan called fiscal illusion as a direct result of getting a lot more government than they pay for. I think we should pay for the government that we want, and then we will make better trade-off considerations, because the issue we have right now, by not pairing tax revenue with the level of spending that the government is doing, we just drive up debt and deficits, with the potential to drive us into a debt crisis or a debt doom loop where interest rates grow at a rate where we have to borrow more just to pay the interest on the debt, and that further drives up interest rates. And that's a scenario that we should avoid. And it's not taking trade-offs into consideration that got us to this point. And so while I don't agree that we necessarily need to raise taxes, because I actually think that we're getting more government than we should be getting, but those two should be much more closely aligned, even just to make those trade-off considerations.
One of the things we've seen in the last couple of weeks is this idea, I think they were created by Senators Romney and Manchin, this idea of creating a debt commission to tackle this thing, to look at ways to resolve the issue of debt. Talk about a little bit, what do you think about the idea on its front, and what makes it effective? What will make it actually work?
Yeah, I think the idea of a fiscal commission has a lot of merit, especially when it comes to tackling politically divisive issues, which I would say Medicare and Social Security reform are prime candidates there. And we saw this approach work in other countries as well. And in the United States, we have had commissions in the past that have been successful. We've had a lot of failures. But if we look at one of the successful commissions, the Base Realignment and Closure Commissions that closed military bases after the Cold War ended, I think it's a really good model for overcoming political division, dealing with a big national problem, and doing so by empowering an expert commission with real authority and not forcing Congress to take an affirmative vote on something that would be very difficult for them to pass through Congress. I do think that the current approach has some flaws, but Congress is moving in the right direction, and I'm very encouraged by legislators on both sides taking the debt more seriously by putting their weight behind a fiscal commission, and then we can look at some of the details for how that needs to be designed so it doesn't become another failed Simpson-Bowles commission.
Mr. Ritson, let's start there. What would make this an effective working commission in your mind?
Yeah, so I think ultimately the thing that we most need to make it an effective working commission is Congress needs to be seriously willing to look at what they produce. I think you put a bunch of experts like me and Ramina in a room, we can produce a plan. We might do a different plan individually, but we could definitely come up with something we could agree on. Whether that passes through Congress is up to Congress. I think the challenge, Ramina says it would be good if Congress didn't have to take the hard vote. But I think the reality is, unlike with a BRAC and the Base Realignment Commission, where it's the placement of bases, and you could argue that's something the military should be doing. Fiscal policy, our budgets, as President Biden says, budgets reflect our values, and the power of the purse is Congress's. It's in the Constitution, and so a broad rewrite of fiscal policy, Congress is going to need to take an up or down vote on it. But I think absolutely having independent experts as part of the conversation is very important. That's something we've pushed for. And I think there needs to be a balance where you have independent experts making sure that the conversation is serious. You're having real conversations about the trade-offs, what's going to be rational economic policy, what works. But you're also going to need to have politicians at the table, because if we produce a really great plan like Simpson Bowles did that doesn't go anywhere, then that's just another failure.
Is this an idea just at this point, or is there actually movement to making this happen?
I think there's real movement. So really what happened was in September there was a big push by some independent experts, I think both of us included, to do a fiscal commission. Congressman Scott Peters and Bill Huizenga in the House introduced a fiscal commission bill. Speaker McCarthy added that to a continuing resolution, one of his many proposals that 198 House Republicans have already voted for. And now we have this bipartisan bill from Senators Manchin and Romney in the Senate, and 8 other co-sponsors. So a tenth of the Senate is already on board. I think there is real momentum for it. And Speaker Johnson has said it's one of his top priorities. So I think there is momentum for it. I think we just need a little bit more support, frankly, from my side of the aisle to get it across, and we're doing what we can to support.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I think it's, basically I would just say Speaker Johnson has said one of his top priorities is a fiscal commission, and Democratic Party leaders have not gone there yet. Thankfully, I think most of them haven't come out against it. I know that there are some on the far left who are not so thrilled about the proposal, but I think that Democratic leadership has been more quiet about it, and I think they will need to support it ultimately, because ultimately for it to be successful, because if this is just a Republican spending cut commission, that doesn't make any sense. That's going to be a failure, and frankly, I think that should be a failure. That would be really bad policy. But I think in order for it to get across the finish line, we'll need more Democratic support.
Ms. Bacha.
Yeah, I agree. There is momentum there. I would say it started even earlier. Senator Romney and Manchin initially introduced the Trust Act. That was in the game last year, and also earlier this year in negotiations over the debt limit. It ultimately did not get attached, and one of the reasons the Trust Act ultimately didn't get the momentum this fiscal commission now we hope will have is because it ended up being considered more of a Republican priority. So it is really important for this to be bipartisan. I am, however, worried that even if a commission came up with a great proposal, because Simpson Bowles did actually come up with a good proposal, for Congress to have to take that affirmative vote to put it into action could kill the proposal. And unless we are really close to, say, Medicare and Social Security running out of funds, because that's what happened with the Greenspan Commission, only because there was the threat of automatic benefit cuts to Social Security were they able to get something through Congress following regular order. And I know the Fiscal Commission is looking at more expedited procedures, no amendments, just an up or down vote. But I question whether that is enough political cover to allow a majority of Republicans and Democrats to sign off on entitlement reform.
Let's hear from Nixon in Florida, independent line. Thanks for waiting. Go ahead.
Good morning. Good morning. I had a question for both of the guests. How much money will we save if we do away with all the billionaires' tax cut? And should Congress bring a bill to the floor, whether they like it or not? If you don't pass the budget, if you don't pay our bills, nobody goes home.
Okay, 2 separate ideas. Ms. Bachi, you want to start?
Yeah. Actually, most of the Trump tax cuts were not for wealthy individuals, but I do think that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit when it comes to a lot of subsidies being doled out through the tax code that we should address, and also tax policy that doesn't make any sense, like the state and local tax deduction, which is in play again, that Democrats seem to want to bring back. And from that perspective, I'm going to have to go to bed. I forgot the second part.
He was like, should Congress stay home unless they pass a budget?
Yes.
Yeah, so.
Actually, I am a proponent of no budget, no pay, which is a different version of this, which says that if Congress doesn't pass a budget, they don't get paid. It's as simple as you should pay for performance, and this is part of Congress's job. I recognize that that is a bit of a could be considered a silly proposal, but when John Boehner imposed this in 2013, it actually worked. And we saw both the House and Senate introduce a budget proposal, and I think that's really important for lawmakers to grapple with our bigger fiscal challenges.
Mr. Ritz.
Yeah, I'll take them in reverse order. I think I'm not as much of a fan of no budget, no pay. I think it makes intuitive sense. It passes the gut check, but the reality is most members of Congress actually come in pretty wealthy. They don't need the paycheck. And I think all it does is it discourages those, lower and middle income folks who represent a broader swath of our community from serving. And it puts undue pressure on them for, frankly, I think a lot of them are voting to keep the government open, and their wealthier colleagues are voting to shut it down. And I don't think that's necessarily fair. And I don't think it worked in this one instance, but I don't think that would solve any of these fundamental problems. To the question of billionaire tax increases, I absolutely think we should be raising taxes on billionaires. Probably won't be a surprise from someone from the Progressive Policy Institute. But I also think that there's only so much money at the top, and we're going to be having a report later this year that I think really illuminates the fact that we can't just get everything we want from taxing the top 1%. If we want a government that works for everyone has to be working to make that work.
We have a few minutes left until the House comes in. Let's hear from Daniel. Daniel in Virginia, Republican line. You're on with our guests. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning, C-SPAN. Thank you for taking my call. Quick comment and then a question for your guests. My comment is that I had an opportunity to live in Copenhagen, Denmark for a few years, which is supposed to be the kind of socialist bastion of utopia for medical care and everything. But I can tell you that they still have private hospitals, and they still have a desire to have second opinions, things like that. But when you have so much of your money taken in taxes, the middle class can no longer afford to buy private insurance and get second opinions and things like that. So that's just one point on that. But my question for the guests is, and particularly for your guests from the PPI, I think it's the Progressive Policy Institute, what are inherent, governmental functions? Can everything be centralized, and done by the central planners and experts? Or what can be pushed off to the state and local level? Why do all the taxes have to be collected at the federal level? Why can't we, use our state and local areas as kind of, experiments and see what works and what doesn't work?
Okay, thanks, caller.
Thanks. That's actually an excellent question. I think that core government functions are mainly public goods, things that the government can do that the private sector can't do. And I think to the caller's point about, which I think is a really federalist point about state versus national government, I think there are some functions that are better handled at the state level, where the government really has to be closer to the people. But at the same time, we need to be wary about a race to the bottom where, we see where some states, they're competing against each other with corporate incentives and tax cuts to attract jobs, where we see differential investments between different states of different levels of wealth. The national government, I think, has a role to play in equalizing those inequalities so that everybody has at least a fair opportunity. And so I think it's important that the government fulfills those responsibilities.
Ms. Baccia.
Yeah, I'll take the healthcare component. I think that putting more of the healthcare dollars that the federal government provides in the form of subsidies directly to people so they can buy insurance that best meets their needs, say through their health savings account, and allowing them to save any excess if they buy lower cost plans than the subsidy provides, in a way that they could use that money for retirement or out-of-pocket costs, deductibles, etc., could really bring about more price transparency in our medical care system, lower prices, increase competition, and allow for a quality healthcare system where individuals are in charge and in control of their own healthcare dollars and health decisions. And we need to move closer to that. Medicare Advantage is one example of that, but I think we can go much further than that.
From Henry in Alabama, Democrats line. We're running a little short on time, Henry, so jump in with your question or comment.
Yes, I believe we should tax anyone above $400,000 a year. The taxes should be raised, and you shouldn't cancel out Social Security at any time in your employment. For the full length of the employment, you should have to pay Social Security, and that would solve the problem. Secondly, we need to load up several B-52 bombers, wipe out Iran's oil field. On returning, wipe out the facilities where they're trying to make a bomb.
Okay. A little beyond our context, but Ms. Bacha, if you wanted to take the Social Security aspect of what
Yeah, I actually think that workers are already paying enough, if not too much, into Social Security at 12.4% of all wages. I think it's particularly troubling for lower and middle income workers. It makes it harder for them to save for their own needs. And in terms of expanding payroll taxes to all income, we would also need to look at how much more the government will pay out in this instance. I think that benefits for the highest income earners are already excessive. And if we cut that tie between what people pay and what they get out, we also change the nature of the program. And in which case, if Social Security will be more of a welfare program, then we should look at who should really get those benefits and who shouldn't.
Mr. Ritz.
I agree with what Romina said. Just one thing I'll add is, I guess two things. Number one, even if we got rid of the payroll tax cap entirely at this point, that's no longer enough to make the program fully solvent. So that's not a solution anymore. It could have been several years ago, but it wouldn't work now. The other point I would make is I think it sounds easy, just make everybody pay the tax, but as Romina said, that's a 12.4% payroll tax. To apply that to all income over $400,000, that is a 12.4% marginal tax rate increase. I don't think that's necessarily bad to do that size tax increase on the wealthy, but if we use that for Social Security, then how are we going to pay for our unfunded Medicare obligations, other public investments? I think that's a real conversation.
Ben Ritz with the Progressive Policy Institute, progressivepolicy.org, the website if you're interested in checking out the organization, and Romina Bacha of the Cato Institute, cato.org is their website. And to both of you, thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks. Again, the House of Representatives set to vote on a plan to short-term extension of funding for the federal government. That deadline on Friday. Follow along on our main channel, C-SPAN. You can follow along at C-SPAN Now. We take you to the House of